to return the space to the sacred container that it was and will always be. So just with that, I just want to share this morning's Torah sheets with all of you. I hope you see that there's a link in there to the Sefaria sheet and also a PDF of it and any other method by which we would open it. I'm going to, let's see, I think I can make this absolutely. So there are a number of directions that we could have gone today. The chapter, Mishpatim is chock full of mitzvot. It's from the beginning of chapter 21 all the way to the end of chapter 24. There are no shortage of mitzvot. In fact, it is the parsha that holds within it the most number of legal statutes, and there are many pieces of it. We could have just then dove in into a number of different places, including at the end of this week's Torah portion, where there is a very mysterious, mystical sighting of the divine, and underneath the divine there is a sapphire brickwork, which we've studied before, and there's an image of God, and there's an eating and drinking with God. There's a lot of very corporeal or very physical attributes given to the divine. There's chapter 24, known as the covenant, the reading of the book of the covenant, and also the blood ceremony that goes with it, and the ratification of that covenant, which we now know of as the Nasa V'Nishma, that we will do, and then we will hear moment where the children of Israel, the Israelites, say, yes, we're on board, yes, give it to us, we're gonna go forward. We could have dove in there, but instead I decided to work with something a little bit less immediately gratifying and maybe even troubling for those of us who read the Torah and assume that it's always going to be beautiful and direct and a straight line between the Torah and our particular version of either justice or political action or moral and ethical behavior. Newsflash, the Torah was written in the Bronze Age, and it has some pieces in it that are without a doubt very difficult for all of us. So why not jump in there? But first, when we jump in, let's begin with last night's reminder of this Vav that I love every year, the Vav of Ve'ela. So if you look at source number 1 in your sheet, you can see it here on the screen. Ve'ela HaMishpati, the very first verse of chapter 21 is Ve'ela HaMishpatim, and the English should be "and these are the rules." Unfortunately, it's just "these are the rules." It should be and right. These are the rules that you shall set before them. Ve'ela HaMishpatim asher tasim lifneihem. Rashi in source number 2, look at source number 2. Rashi, of course, is not, it's a big deal that there's this ve'ela. And Rashi says, wherever it says eile, these, it cuts off posel et harishonim. It will invalidate the ones that come before, right? Right, if you say, these, it means these and not those, right, these. Now, is that rule, a hard, fast rule across all of, Torah? It's not in every case. And sometimes the commentators, because of this rule, must, exert tremendous amount of energy to try to explain why this particular Eile is not posel et harishonim, doesn't invalidate the ones that came before. But here, in this particular instance, the ve'ele, Rashi says, mosif al harishonim. Ma harishonim misinai af elu misinai. Just as the ones that came before are from Sinai, these two are from Sinai. Now, the rest of the shiur, the rest of our time together is not going to be spent on this particular Rashi or on this particular moment in the Parsha, but of course this is the opening volley in after Sinai. And so Rashi in the 11th century, which is again, Rashi is in a long history of exegetical force and exegetical direction, right, needing to explain why the ve'ela. Why does it say ve'ela and these? And so Rashi says it means to tell us that we need to sew together, we need to stitch together what came before and what's about to come. Now, why would one think that these two things are distinct? In other words, what's the havamina, as we would say in the Gemara? Like, what's the presumptive, that you would say, oh, the ones that are about to arrive, in other words, the statutes in this coming number of chapters is distinct and different from the ones that came before. So clearly there was a tradition that sought to make some kind of distinction between the Decalogue, or between the moment of Sinai and then these kind of man-made laws. There was already a sectarian debate in the Second Temple period and later on in the first millennia about whether or not Mishpatim, this coming week's Torah portion, right, is from Sinai, right? Or, a group of men, gathered around a table and said, here are the laws, right? And so certainly there's a polemical force to what Rashi is saying. Rashi is saying, no, these man-made laws that have to do with morality and ethics and how we treat one another and interpersonal connection are not to be made distinct from Sinai, right? Sinai is divine. Everybody agreed at that point, right? That it's divine. And so are the ones that are coming, right? But on a more prosaic level, I was talking about this with Rabbi Koloretzis yesterday. I think what Rashi is also saying, and I alluded to it last night, but more explicitly now, is that in some profound way, there always has to be some addition on what came before. Meaning, when Rashi says Vav is Mosif al Rishonim, he's not just saying, oh, these particular laws that are about to arrive are in addition to what took place at Sinai, but everything after Sinai is Mosif al Rishonim. Everything from Sinai on, right, from last week's third portion, including the man-made laws and the human-made laws and the human interpretations and the commentaries. In other words, Rashi's comment here on the Vav that connects Sinai and Mishpatim is a general commentary and on expansion and on human initiative and on human creativity and human engagement. Right? The fact that we continue to engage in Sinai is itself Sinai. Right? Don't think that when you sit at a table on 105th Street in Amsterdam and you struggle with text, that you're somehow posel the rishonim. You're like, you have to throw away what came before. It's like, like when they sat down in the Reform movement in Pittsburgh, in the Pittsburgh platform, or before that in Germany, and they said, let's get rid of this part here. We don't like this part, or this part about this embarrassing cult with, kashrut and everything. No, get rid of that. And we'll take a little bit of that, and a little bit of that. And that whole approach is so antithetical to the way that the rabbis imagined the continuity of Sinai. That Sinai was that, of course, we would come up against ethical and moral problems because later generations would struggle with earlier generations, the Rishonim. But don't posel the Rishonim. Don't invalidate the ones who came before by saying, oh, how could it be that they were so backwards? And how could they have thought that this was moral? Try to understand them on their own terms, in their own context, where they were historically. And then go ahead and add to the Rishonim, right? Mosif al Rishonim, go ahead and add your 2 cents and be a part of the commentator and the oral tradition that continues unabated and uninterrupted for the last 2,000 years. So with that editorial from Rashi, and or from Reb Zalman, or from anyone, right? That's Reb David, and me, all of us, right? So with that trigger warning, let's go to the very first verses in this week's Torah portion, which are cut off. Maybe that's the sign is that they cut them off. Right? Oh, Gaval. Okay, let's look at the Torah, right? The Torah tells us in chapter 21. Unfortunately, it cut off. I really should have started earlier. It's not actually in here. I only gave you the Okay, let's go back. 1 second.
Do you want a chumash?
Yeah, I just need to give you a chumash. I don't know why it's not in here. Let me.
Okay.
1 second. Can you all? Let's see. Let's go to. Just gonna share my screen here for just a brief moment, and then we'll go back to the source sheet. Okay, so. We're in chapter 21.
Wow, some smooth technology.
Yes, chapter 21. Are you ready? Okay, here we go. Let's do it as Zoe. I like it like that, side to side. Okay, Kitik Ne Evid Evri. This is the very first one of these 53 some odd laws. Can everybody see this in the in your yeah, you can see it, okay. Ki tikne eved ivri, when you will acquire a Hebrew serf. This is this is the beautiful translation of Everett Fox, known for being hyper literal, but also really also extremely true to the meaning and to the alliterations and the musicality and all of that. So when you will acquire a Hebrew serf, sheish shanim ya'avod, 6 years that service to serve. Uva shvi'it, but in the 7th, yetzei, right? Latzei means to have an exodus. Yetzei, l'chavshi chinam, to freedom or liberty for nothing. Chinam here means for free, right? Right? Im b'gapo yavo, b'gapo yetzei. If he came by himself, he needs to go out by himself. Im bal ishahu, v'yatza ishto imo. If he has a if he was the spouse of a wife, his wife is to go out with him as well. Ima donav yitem lo isha, but if his wife is given, if his lord, his master, gives him a wife, and she bore him sons or daughters, yadolo vanim ovanot, aisha viladeh tiyel adoneha, the sons or daughters, will be the wife and those she bore are to remain the masters, and he is to go out by himself. And he goes out by himself. V'im amor yomar ha'eved, and if the serf should say, yes, say, believe it or not, say, ahavti et adoni, I love my master, et ishti ve'et banai, my wife and my children, lo et say, chavshi, I will not go out at liberty. I do not want to be liberated. In that case, the gisho adonav ela Elohim, and if that happens, let his master bring him to the God oracle, right? Or here it means judges, or it could be the magistrate, right? A number of different, if you look here, Fox translates this in a number of ways. He says it's either, right, the judges or the oracle, right? Yehigisho el hadelet, and bring him close to the delet, which is the door, or el hamezuzah, or to the post, right, the mezuzah. The ratzah adonav does no, ba'martzeh, and now let his master pierce his ear with a piercer. The avado leolam, and in that case, let him then become his slave or his servant forever. Now, if you go back here, Everett Fox, in his understanding, writes this in source number 4, back in the sources. Given the importance of the root serve in the book of Exodus in source 4, it is fitting that the covenant code opened with this theme. Right, the word serve here means eved, right, which is, of course, within the book of Exodus, one of the most important words found. The word eved appears everywhere, of course, in the story of the Hebrew slaves, right, in the land of Egypt and so on. Now we're arriving at the covenant code, which is what Mishpatim is, and it opens with that theme. And in the verses we just read, the text considers the case of the native serf, a status rather like that of the indentured servant in early American history. Immediately, the act of releasing such an individual, providing for his going out, is stipulated. For they are my servants whom I brought forth out of the land of Egypt. While the institution of serfdom existed of necessity in ancient Israel, it could not be tolerated as a permanent and fully dehumanizing one. On the other hand, these regulations deal with natives and not with foreigners. Note the use of the 7 here as the number of perfection and limit. The servant goes free after 7 years, just as the land rests every 7 years, the Shemitah, right? And so here, the Torah is inviting us into something called, what is called Eved Ivri. And if you look here in the 12th century, Maimonides codifies what's happening here in the text. Eved Ivri, Amur Batorah, if you look in source number 5, are people there? Can you see source 5? right? The term Hebrew servant. Ze Yisraeli shemachru oso beis din al korcho o hamocher atzmo liritzono. In this case, the Eved Ivri is a Jew whom the court sells by compulsion, or a person who sells themselves willing. What does that mean? What's the case? Ketzad Ganav ve'en lo lishalem es hakeren. If the person stole and they can't repay, he doesn't have resources to repay the principal, then the court will sell them. And that's right. The Rambam Maimonides here explains that he explained it already in another section of his code about the laws of stealing, right? Kemosha Amru b'Hilchos Geneva. Le'ein lecha ish b'Yisrael shemochin oto beit din el hagana bilvad. The only person, according to the Rambam here, Maimonides says, the only one who can be quote unquote sold, right, is by the beit din, by the magistrate, is the one who steals. Right? It says, but if a person, right, concerning such a thief, is sold by the court, this is when you acquire. That's what we're talking about here, right? But it doesn't mean like when you just go around and acquire slaves because they're everywhere. It's no. If the person is a thief and they can't repay, the court gives them a method by which to repay their debt. They've stolen something, and right, they can sell themselves, as it were. They have some value to become an indentured servant, right? And this is the meaning. Alavu omer b'mishneh Torah ki macher lecha, and in Deuteronomy chapter 15, later on in the Torah, another midrashic source, as Rabbi Kolaras has pointed out and others have pointed out, the Torah itself does midrash on itself. It expands upon itself as it moves along in the Torah itself. Later on, look at Deuteronomy, it says, when your brother, right, will sell themselves to you. Achicha, mocher atzmo ketzad. So what does it mean when you sell yourself? This is a person who's become so poor and so impoverished, the Torah gives them permission to sell themselves as an indentured servant. Right? If a person, that's the case in the book of Leviticus, where your brother, your kinsman, your fellow human has become so impoverished that they have to sell their body, as it were, sell themselves into servitude to be of service. The Eino Rashai Linkort Atzmo, the Torah says you cannot sell yourself. The Rambam here codifies, right? Unless, hopefully I can go to the next page here. This is always tricky. I don't want to go too far. Go up. Are we going up here? No. Huh. Interesting. 1 second. I knew it. That's the culprit. Okay. All right. Sorry. Let's go up here. Ella imkain. The only way the person can sell themselves, ulatznia et damav. You can't do it. You're not allowed. Says the Torah. Says the Rambam. You're not allowed. Limkod atzmo latznia et damav oliknot bahem schora. You can't do it in order to stash away money or to use it to buy merchandise or utensils or give it to a creditor. You can only sell yourself only when you need the money to be alive. A person is not permitted to sell themselves unless he has no property remaining at all, right? Even if his clothing no longer remains. It has to be that they don't even have clothing. In that position, they can then, right, sell themselves. So this particular moment, just coming back to this moment, right? The Torah is essentially inviting us into a situation where the mechanism, right? The mechanism of the sensitivity that we as Jews or as Israelites who are reading the Torah, the sensitivity we have to slavery is, first of all, the first mitzvah, the first azhara. And the first mitzvah of coming out of Egypt is couched in a limit, a delimiting of the period of time that a person can be a slave, number one. And number two, the conditions, according to the tradition, the conditions upon which one may allow oneself to be in a relationship with this kind of, this institution, as it were. So the first thing to notice in our journey from Sinai to Mishpatim is that the reality of slavery was very much a reality in the ancient world, number one. Number two, the Torah is clearly not doing away with the entire institution of indentured servitude to some degree, but the Torah is seeking to limit its dehumanization. It's also saying that if you come into the place where you now have power to have a slave, do it differently. And number three, like the limits here are also in a way that actually are empowerment, as it were, for the individual. The empowerment of the person to be able to say, I choose to use this institution for my own benefit to some degree, and the Torah gives that, right, allows that on some level for a period of time under certain conditions in order for it to be of use to some degree, right? So that's part of the evident restructure. Of course, the problem, of course, is that the Torah, before we go into the Midrashim or whatever it might be, but like what's the meaning of what do we make of this moment where the person says, I don't want to be free? Even if we can come to terms with the first element, which is like, okay, the Torah said, right, it's not exactly slavery, it's indentured servitude. We kind of get it. If a person is an indigent individual, we give them the kind of the agency to kind of give away some of their freedoms for the sake of their, right, being able to remain alive, wherever it might be. But what about that moment where the Torah seems to say, right, what's the meaning of the verses, Ahavti et Adoni? A person says, I love my master and I want to stay. Where the Torah essentially says, you were a slave, your master gave you a wife, and you have children, and now you have a choice between freedom or staying with the family that you've created. What's the energy around that moment? Is that moment a negative moment, a positive moment? Is it how do we understand the next moment where they bring him to the doorpost and they pierce that person's ear? Is that what's happening there? So I'm kind of curious what your sense is before we even look at the way the tradition looks at it. And we can also open this up to see a lot of, let's go to Beth, and then we'll come back into the room as you guys cook on this. Go ahead, Beth.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
This is such a non-choice for a man who's got a wife and children. Just look around the Zoom room, look around the physical room you're in. How many of these men would willingly give up your wives and your kids? I would say it's asymptotically approaching zero. It's just.
Where do I sign? Where do I sign?
I'm not sure you want to ask that question,
Okay. Everybody's got their moments where they feel like, I'm out of here. But
I don't know.
A decent guy isn't going to give up his wife and his kids. Party.
It does seem so. It's certainly the case. Like before we look at the way the tradition works with this moment, I mean, a simple reading of the text through our lens, of course, from our lens looking back, it's really it's hard to read this in a negative way. To choose to stay with your master because you love your master. First of all, it says the word love. It says, it's a very interesting thing. It says, Im amor yamar, ahavti et Adoni. I love my master. Et ishti vet banai. It's like a very powerful thing. The Torah doesn't often use the word love in these kind of more transactional contexts, and it's kind of an odd. So it's hard. It's almost a horrible moment, but it's also it's almost a beautiful moment. So you could say, if you didn't know the tradition is going to come along, and I'm kind of like spoiler alert, the tradition is going to actually find fault with this choice. If you didn't know, then what would it mean, right? That the person makes this proclamation, and it says, "I love my master. I love this life that I have. I discovered family I didn't know I had. They've taken care of me. I'm a part of this community." What does it mean that he's taking his ear to the doorpost, and becomes Eved Le'olam, becomes like a forever servant. It has to be viewed as a positive moment almost. So like, how would you see it positively? Or let me just, so Thomas and then Tony and.
Just briefly on the social history, because as someone who came out of the British class system, this is a big part of it, that these hierarchies were really formalized in the 18th and 19th century, and earlier on, and I suspect this is in other traditions, when you spoke of someone's household, you meant the family, but you also meant the extended family of retainers and nursemaids and everything kind of in a feudal system at any level. And of course, that's deeply problematic in some ways, but I think in the past, and I know at least in the English system, and presumably in others, there's much more ambiguity about these boundaries that were later enforced. And the bonds of service and the bonds of family were blurred, and there was even intermarriage. And you know, we think of all these beautiful handmaidens and you know, the Hagars and the other attendants of the world who kind of blended into the greater family. And so I just think, to the extent that a historical context helps, the picture is more complex and less enforced than it came to be, even with this terrifying word slavery.
Right, and thank you for that context. And also, it's certainly the case here that the Torah it's not accidental. Torah opens up, right, the post-slavery moment, like the freedom moment of Sinai is then led into like legislation around an institution that was deeply traumatizing for the Israelites who heard it, but like who recognized that institution and was sought to make it more compassionate, and the bonds of servitude and the bonds of family are blurred, as you said, and certainly the case, you know, so maybe bringing, right, in this context, bringing that servant's ear to the doorpost, right, is significant because it says on a simple level, without getting into the you know, the allegorical possibilities and the significance of the mezuzah and the delet and the door, right, it's just that you're now one of us, right, you're one of us. This is a way of saying you're part of our family and we'll protect you. Right, you are part of this family. You have the insignia, as it were, of this quote unquote of this family, and you're with us forever. Right? It's not. It doesn't have a pejorative. It doesn't have a negative connotation. It's just almost like right, again, it's a rite of passage, as it were, literally of that passageway and a rite of passage. Yeah. So go ahead, Tony.
So, in that light, it's helpful, I think, to remind ourselves how afraid and unsafe all of us feel. Because the protection of a master who has power, who wouldn't go for that?
Well, we're going to come to that very deep psychological insight in a moment, because you and Eric Fromm.
Exactly.
So we're going to Eric Fromm, I promise.
While we're at it, let's invoke Zorba the Greek, who says, it says to the Alan Bates character in the movie, you're in the full catastrophe.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's prison here and there's prison here.
Right.
Choose your poison.
I hear it. We're coming to Eric Fromm, because in the school of this moment being positive, this is certainly not a positive moment from a Frommian perspective, and you'll see the antecedents to Fromm are already in the text and in the tradition. We're going to see it in literally one moment, but first Rabbi Kalarazis, and then we'll make our way. Rabbi, yeah.
So coming off of Tony's point, is freedom having nothing left to lose, or is freedom being connected and part of a structure and being with those you love? Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, you can imagine the slave going out free and having absolutely nothing.
Right.
Free.
Right.
So I'm wondering here, which is freedom?
Right. And it brings up, in terms of our community's focus on like criminal justice reform and incarceration, right? Like how frequently recidivism is such a common phenomenon, not because of criminality, but because of three meals. Exactly. There is a certain, it's such a deep psychological truth that you're speaking to, the freedom from and the freedom to, and how if you've spent 6 years, right, 6 years being worked like the land is being worked, how hard it then is to go out and do Shemitah, right, to free yourself, especially when your bondage has made you bonded. You're bonded through your bondage, right? And so it's really, I think we went straight for it. I think the positive elements here are really, like the simplicity of the text is ahavti adad, you know, like there's nothing negative. Although if you study the way that I did growing up, it's almost impossible to read this in a positive light, because you immediately go to Rashi, and you immediately go to the Midrashim, which we're gonna go to in a second, but just, yeah, and then I also saw Daniel.
This is sort of part of what
Sorry, but I
everyone
didn't know
else,
your name.
Russell,
Okay, Russell.
part of what everyone else has sort of responded to in some way. And I'm asking it also in the context of the source and the first part of this, which is the thief. So if someone cannot support themselves when they're freed, then it isn't the same kind of choice, and it becomes a cause and effect. If you're a thief because you're poor, so then you become a slave, and if you're so destitute that you sell yourself to become a slave, then this is sort of embedded in the economic life, cultural system of the community. And so later, they say when the slave leaves, you give them this, you give them that because they've given you good service, as if to deal with that very issue. The question I also had, though, was, is the thief then, when the Beit Din sells the thief, is the thief sold as the repayment itself to the person who was stolen, or is the thief's sale recoup some sort of financial remuneration that then goes to the person who's harmed? In other words, then the thief is living with the person he stole from.
Right.
And so it's an extended
Right,
relationship.
no, so it's clear from the text that you're not actually becoming the property of the quote unquote of the person you stole from.
Right.
It's remuneration, and then you can pay that person back, right? Because it would be dangerous for to be placed into the house of somebody whom you stole from for obvious reasons. And by the way, here, anyway, so that's a great question, and it is a part of the institution, as it were. It's hard to know whether or not the institution was actually, to what extent, history is very vague here on whether or not this is actually an institution that we have any record of it existing, right, in some way. But certainly part of the process of vaving the text and adding our voices to it and being in dialogue with a burgeoning sense of ethical and moral treatment of other human beings is that, Rambam, you can feel Rambam in light of the Talmud already working with this text and trying to work out the institution, in its elements of dehumanizing and trying to make it more and more human. I really want to get to, we have to get to Rashi for a second, and we're going to come back. Yeah, Neshama,
it seemed to me like it's sort of a repetition of the covenant, that doorpost, that the judges sold the thief was given to make up for his failure or his poverty. But this, when he chooses to stay with the master he loves, he chooses. That seems to me like a repetition of the covenant at Sinai. I choose of my own free will to.
It's so fascinating. So that, again, this is so great when you say things like that, because it's so, if you grow up in listening to Rashi as your first, the first stop on your interpretive journey, on your exegetical imagination, you're limited. Actually, it's wonderful. Rashi opens things, but also closes it. So what you're saying is it's reminiscent of hearing at Sinai. So that your choice at Sinai to say we will hear. Now this moment of choosing to be with this master is a choice that is celebrated by coming, having your ear, pierced. Now, the piercing, in that valence, the piercing is positive. It's like the rite of passage is reminiscent of the listening that happened at Sinai. But that's not the way the tradition, God bless you. It is not the way the tradition, if you look here on the screen, I don't know how this didn't make it into my source sheet. It was the first source, but let me show you Rashi here, right? What does it mean that he was pierced? If he says this and his ear is pierced, why the doorpost? Here Rashi quotes, I'm so sorry, I cannot do it in the English. Ela delet ola mezuzah. What does it mean that, that he is in the delet mezuzah? It means, where is it? Where's the source? Oh, there it is, okay. If you sell yourself, Rashi says in the name of the Midrash here, V'im mocher atzmo ozen sheshama al har Sinai ki li b'nei Yisrael avadim. The ear that heard on Sinai, you are my servants. And went and acquired a master for themselves, tirza, right? Let that ear go and be pierced. Rabbi Shimon Hayad Daresh Mikra Zeh Kimin Chomer Man Ishtanu Delet. Right? He says, right? God says to them, like I passed over your lintel, I passed over your doorpost, and said to you, you are my servants, and now you become avadim la'avadim. You are my servants, and now you're going to make yourself a servant of another servant. So in that valence, and here I'm going to go back to our sources. This is the valence of that really begins this journey of that Tony, alludes to here of what the Midrash also picks up on, which is that this is not seen as a positive moment in the Torah, right? Bo Re'eh in source number 8. Look at source number 8. Kama mishubachat parsha zu. How beautiful are the this parsha. Kama parshiyot ba. Uvechama azarot hisir Kadosh Baruch Hu Yisrael b'parsha zu. The Shemot Rabbah, Exodus Rabbah, the great midrashic source, really, latter part of the first millennia, says how great is this parsha? It's so many other mini parshiyot are in it, and so many mini warnings are in it. And God opened not with one of the many, but with one specific one, which is Eved Ivri, the Hebrew serf. Amar Lahem HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yisrael, the Holy One said to the children of Israel, right? Ani kaniti etchem b'Mitzrayim v'eser makot she'eiti. I acquired you in Egypt with the 10 plagues that I showed you. Shene'emar nifla'im me'asecha v'nafshi yodat me'od. How great and wondrous are your acts, and my soul intimately knows them. Just as you are commanded not to allow your brother to serve you more than 6 years, as I created the world in 6 days, so too, right, are you commanded not to, right, that you have to have mercy on your brother and only have them work for 6 years, right? It's not natural, right? The natural is 6 days and 6 years, but right, it's really not a great institution, right? It's not a great institution. The Zohar goes on to say, right, the Midrash Agadah says, Ki tikne Eved Ivri in source 9, it begins with justice. Lefi shayu ov avadim b'Mitzrayim u'p'da'am HaKadosh Baruch Hu v'natam lem cherut. It says God gave you freedom, right? Lefikach tzivah Yisrael b'rishona shelo l'shabed b'achiu b'farach v'lo l'shabdo l'dorot. Right? This is the mitigating force, right? You guys were free people, so make sure not to enslave other people, right? But clearly, the onus in these 2 midrashim are on us not to enslave others, but the onus in the midrash about the ear is that should never be your reality. You should never ever sell yourself into slavery, right? And if you look here in the source number, I think it's source 6, if I'm not mistaken, the Zohar says, or source 7 rather, right? If a person refuses to go free, they impair the place from which freedom flows down into the world, which is Bina, right? The person is in some way leaving the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, accepting the yoke of the master, right? Right? This opening, by the way, because the opening of the doorpost is like the opening of the womb, which is the mother's womb, which is Bina. And so the door becomes a symbol of freedom, of birth into the world. And if you want to be a slave, if your escape from freedom involves an escape back into Egypt, you're essentially going back, right, through the birth canal. You're refusing to be born, as it were, in the image of the Zohar. And this, if you come back now, full force, is what essentially Eric Fromm wrote about when he wrote his famous book, Escape from Freedom. If you look, I hope it came out. It's like I'm not having good luck today with my sources. But is it not on the 13? All right. Eric Fromm's theory of the human condition begins with the insight that freedom itself can sometimes be the cause of fear and anxiety, forcing us to find ways to escape from freedom. And he writes that there are three ways that we escape from freedom. One is authoritarianism, one is destructiveness, and the third one is the automaton conformity. That are the 3 ways of coping with that freedom and the fear that it entails. The process from embeddedness to freedom is one that everyone goes through in their own individual life. As children, we're all safe and fully unfree. That's not true, but let's say later, as we step out of childhood, we have to increasingly make our own choices to choose our friends, lovers, right? A field of study or job. And these are extremely wide-ranging, let's say, decisions for us in the developed world, that's true. But they have consequences for the rest of our lives, right? Do I say, this person wrote, should I start smoking or not? Should I be cool or nerdy? Should I study philosophy or get a well-paying job, right? Right, all of these decisions, right? And so, right, this freedom, more and more, we realize that freedom is not only a blessing, but also a heavy burden. And if we cannot handle it, we might wish to escape from freedom. And he goes on, in Fromm's book, he writes about how we give away our freedom. For example, authoritarianism is giving away our freedom, right, in governance. Destructiveness is when we feel anxiety about a particular area of our lives, we, instead of choosing to be constructive, we choose to destroy, which is a way of limiting choices and limiting freedoms. And the third one is to be a conformist who says, listen, I can't, there are too many choices, I'll just let everybody else decide what I should be doing, and then I'll follow them. This becomes in Kabbalah and in Chassidut, this becomes the meaning of this mitzvah. And the meaning of going to the mezuzah is the meaning of that the person who says I will not become free is essentially in the language of in the more moralistic language of Rashi, or we might say in the more psycho-spiritual language of Chassidut and of others, that the doorpost represents the courage to step into the unknown and into freedom in spite of the fear and anxiety that it has. And that the rite of piercing the ear is another moment of, it's the anti-mezuzah moment. It's to say, to some degree, that the anxiety that is produced by imagining myself outside of that doorpost, outside of that frame, right, is overwhelming for me, right? And in this valence, ahavti et adoni is not I love my master because they're so good to me, or I love my wife and my children, but I love the certainty and the familiar and the domesticity that I have discovered. This is again, it's a little bit of a field from we're in the vav of expansion here and of meeting reality. Sometimes that domestic reality, whatever it might be, is limiting my freedom to such a degree that I am in some way in violation of the innate freedom that Exodus represents, the innate freedom to, right, that I must let go of that to become, right? When we think of the Buddha, nobody ever comes along and says the Buddha, like I've never heard anybody say the Buddha was abandoned his wife and his children in order to become the great enlightener of all beings.
I actually said it in.
Tony said it, okay. Besides Tony, until this moment, Tony is the first person.
The name of his son does translate as impediment.
Impediment, exactly. So the name of the Buddha's son was impediment, right? So there are this notion that freedom, right? That billions of people have benefited from that moment of domestic abandonment that the Buddha engaged in to some degree. And again, without holding the Buddha up as the clarion call for all people to leave their families and so on to become free, right? This is not like, what's the name of that movie with beautiful, the midlife crisis of Kevin, anyway,
Benjamin Button?
No, it's a beautiful, whatever, it was, so anyway,
Let us know when you think of it. Let us know, we're all ears.
oh my goodness. All right, let's open it up. We're in the room and then we'll go to the Zoom. So we have a lot of Zoomers, so let's hear from them and then we'll come back to Jeff and to Thomas. So I think it was Daniel and then Bev. Go ahead, Daniel.
Shabbat shalom. I'm
Good to see you,
getting back a
Daniel.
little bit to Beth's comment about who would want that, and what came to my mind were like people who are in sects, right? That they follow a master, a leader, and as you put, there's two kinds of masters, right? The one that tells you, you follow me, absolute loyalty, and I'll take care of you. So for a lot of people, this responsibility is too much. They prefer to just have their needs and the choices be made for them in exchange of security. And I think that the big difference for our master, the way it's put, is that you have to go out in the world and you have to assume responsibility, and that entails risk. And for a lot of people, it's better to stick with the known instead of risking with the unknown. And just as a reminder, this generation, I mean, they were raised in this other model where everything was taken care for them. And I see the message is that for some, it's impossible to get rid of that, so much so that this generation died, right, in Sinai. So
Yes.
that was the ultimate solution for them. You know, there was no way out.
Right, right. The sense that in some way, shape, or form, you know, the famous adage that scientific revolution proceeds one funeral at a time. And the often the paradigm that we're brought into becomes a master too. It's hard to see outside of the whatever it is that's providing us our livelihood, right? To be able to step outside at great risk and great cost is also an expansion of this principle, right? Again, in the simple meaning of the text, there's great sympathy for the love that is fostered under these conditions, but in the more metaphorical, allegorical sense, there is a beautiful teaching in the Torah this week about what you just said, Daniel, that to some degree, if you're bought into a sect, whatever that sect might be, it might be really authoritarian, it might be just, right, the general principle, like, you know, that in Daniel Pink's book about regret that I quoted last year and that I gave my sermon on this past high holidays, right, the greatest regret that has been measured across multiple studies over like at least a half a century are regrets around partnerships and marriage and around intimate relationships. And if you were to ask those people what kept you in that bad marriage, it was the kids, it was the family. And by the way, studies show that actually the studies are not clear that that is a bad thing necessarily to make that choice. You know, kids who come from a broken home, it's a deep phenomenon, right? But you know, those people, if you ask them moment to moment, they would say ahavti. They might not say ahavti ishti, or they might not say I love my wife, my husband, my partner, but they might say I'm afraid of what might happen if I leave this situation. Like I'm leaving this situation, I can't leave. And it's not always roses, right? It's not always like, oh, like we in the West, you know, follow your daemon, follow your voice, but like, it's complicated. It's complicated. We have, you know, Mary Oliver's poem on you know, the time that you had to leave is, you know, on the one hand, and then you have the reality of domestic life and the impact of your decisions on multiple actors is on the other hand, and it's not a simple, reality, and the Torah acknowledges that by allowing this, you know, as it were, in this metaphor to continue, like, yes, but at least remind yourself that you're, you know, that you've limited your freedom to some extent, and that's okay. So Bev, then we're gonna go into the room for the last 5 minutes, okay? A little bit, Bev.
Yes, good morning. Shabbat Shalom. I had 2 points that I was thinking about. The first is kind of circles back to Beth's comment earlier about the lack of choice, like someone who chooses to remain a slave. And I was thinking about, like, from a psychological perspective, about Stockholm syndrome, which is a real thing. And people start to identify with the oppressor as a way of being safe. And that is a very real phenomenon. And in these very extreme situations, of which slavery is one, you know, it's not really a choice. It's really, you know, it's really a survival thing that then somehow becomes quote unquote about choice, but it's not. I remember I ran programs for refugees and torture survivors and worked with young men from Africa who had been adolescent soldiers and were horrified at what they had done once they were in the United States and settled and safe. But in the moment, they were very much aligned with, you know,
So
that's
thanks. Yeah, thank you. I think that's a real, that's a reality. You know, and I think that in this case, the Torah, right, I want to be careful because I think that we're not talking about slavery per se. We're here talking about kind of an institution that is allowing for a person to, you know, to keep themselves afloat and so on, but in that rendering. But yes, certainly Stockholm Syndrome is a reality, and identifying with your oppressor and the question of whether or not one can be truly free in making those choices. is also like a broader question too. It's like, what does it really mean when you say lo eitzei chofshi? I won't go free. And the Torah gives agency to the person to say, I won't go free. Right? The Torah doesn't ask the master, but then your question, of course, is, well, do they really get to say that? Right? Is that when they say it, are they being truthful and honest? And I think that's a big question and a good question. Jeffrey, yeah.
So it seems ironic that if the tradition, especially starting with Rashi, comes down on the side of freedom, traditional Jewish society is the least free society I almost can think about, right? You have no freedom in traditional Jewish society. You have to follow certain laws. You have to be within, you can't marry outside the society. You can't, the only thing you're free to do is to study Torah. And frankly, you're only free to study Torah if you're a male in traditional Jewish society. So Judaism is really like has created, it's amazing the slavery that Judaism has created to traditional Jewish society, which is very distinct from a modern American view of what freedom is. We have an absurd attachment to choice and to freedom, often to our detriment. I'll never forget like one thing I heard about Taliban society, which imposed burqas on women. And their argument, somebody argued, no, you think that you're free, your women are free to wear whatever they want, to be subject to the pressure of all kinds of, sexual, Our women are free to not have to worry about it. Right. So I think that this polemic is very interesting.
Well, I think that at risk of opening up a much bigger conversation, which of course we should, and we're free to, but not really because we're limited by the time that we have, so we're not as free as we think. I think that it's absolutely true. It's absolutely true that the Jewish conception of freedom is not disingenuous, right? Rashi and the Midrash say there is no absolute freedom in the way that we construct freedom. There is a similar freedom to what you were saying in terms of more fundamentalist freedoms, right? Fundamentalist, meaning religious fundamentalism. We are still slaves, but we're slaves to God, right? We're not free from God, and we're not free, right? That took Voltaire, and it took the Enlightenment, right, to ultimately free us, as it were, with our minds and so on. And anybody would argue, and someone who was Orthodox for my whole young adult life, and then into my late teens, early 20s, it's certainly the case that I prefer the freedom that I currently enjoy, and I think that there's rational basis for that freedom over the freedom of fundamentalist religion. And I agree with you that it's a bit ironic for Rashi to say freedom in this way, but again, it's not ironic if you understand where the Midrash is coming from. It says you are free to be a servant of God. And in fact, even in the tradition it says, Ein ben chorin, there isn't a free person, ela mi shelamei Torah. Freedom in the traditional Jewish context, rabbinically constructed, is not freedom from mitzvot, it's freedom to do mitzvot, right? And so it's the classic formulation from Isaiah Berlin is freedom from is Exodus, and Sinai is freedom to, right? And so when we stood at Sinai, we became indentured servants, as it were, to God. And God said, okay, but now you can never be a slave to any other human being. Now, we take that notion, slave, it has such a pejorative, and it should. To be a slave is a horrible, and even in the Zohar, by the way, later rabbinic tradition says that being a slave is not nearly as good as being a child. And when thinking about our service of God, that we're God's servants as opposed to God's children, the Zohar says one is fear and one is love, and that the higher level is to be related to God as a child or as a parent or as a lover, and not as a servant, because servants are always in fear. And so there is that later recognition of that frame as a limiting frame. And I think you're right. I think that as a last little silo, my own little volley here is, and I was listening to a number of different podcasts in the last couple of weeks about freedom and cultural relativism. And I would say that those of us who think that freedom is a good thing should also be on the bandwagon of judging other cultures who don't provide that. And meaning, it's not okay to say about traditional Jews that there's no freedom, but then to say, but Muslim burqas are a cultural, choice who are we to judge other cultures? I think that it's okay, and we have enough information to say that it's better for women and all humans to be literate than to have their literacy taken from them. And I think we can weigh in right, on what freedom looks like and what certain cultures, no matter how beautiful those cultures might be, some of their practices are not, don't promote human flourishing, and we can say that unequivocally. And if we can say it about ultra-Orthodox Jews, we can certainly say it about everybody else. And I couldn't agree more. Okay, a couple more in the room. I saw people with hands. So yeah, Yasala and then Wendy. Go ahead.
I'm perplexed here. Where's Dorsey? There's no buyout.
There's no buyout.
Yeah, there's no chance. It's either A or B. Either stays or he goes. Where's the? He can go with. He fell in love. Where's C?
Right.
He fell in love.
Yeah.
Maybe he has no money now, but he'll work now that he's being rehabbed, so to speak, in these 6 years. Where's the chance for him to buy out?
Yeah. No, that's the problem in the text.
It's just A or B.
It's either you have to be free or like you can't. Like why can't you?
But he can't take what he fell in love with.
He fell in love, right? And why? And like
give him the chance.
In that sense, it's on the shot level. It's still not yet as advanced.
Because so much of this time was supposed to be rehab. He's supposed to learn as a model from his master and all those things throughout all this time, how to be in society.
Right.
And that's not how society works.
Right. And the problem, of course, in the text has not yet come to fully recognize that that which belongs to the owner, as it were. There's children, right? And still seeing children as chattel, right? So that's still the text hasn't evolved enough all the way to where we are, but in the metaphor, it actually works well. In the allegorical reading, it works very well because there is no way out. It's should I stay or should I go? If I go, they're really right. So it's like you really don't. That's why it's so risky and why it takes tremendous courage in that moment. Yeah, but on the shot level, it's still troubling for sure. Yeah, Wendy.
In this parsha, it shows that like the children are kind of, if you see the slave as the principal, the children are like the interest.
Exactly.
And so going forward in the Talmud, that principle goes on in multiple different circumstances, separating who gets the principal, who gets the interest. And that's seen going forward in many instances in the Talmud. And the children are unfortunately seen as the interest. And I wish the Torah,
I wish the
Torah implored the generosity of the master to let the slave go free with his wife and children.
Amen.
And I wish the Torah said, like the master should have generosity to let them go forward.
One of the things that I wanted to do in this class, because I knew that I was going to be discussing this, was there was part of me that wanted to show you, I wanted to juxtapose this text with text later on that says, Ger v'yatom lo tilchatz, where it says, like where the Torah says, a stranger and an orphan and a widow do not oppress them. Because I wanted to show you how remarkable it is to find a text that is progressive only to the degree that in its own time, and then part of the Torah which is progressive for all time. And now those two things can live together in the same parsha, which is getting me so crazy making. Like, remember, like it says, remember that you were once 36 times in the Torah, remember that you were once Gerim, stranger in a strange land. It repeats it over and over again, and then it says, and therefore do not oppress the widow and do not oppress the orphan. And then the Torah says, and then this is like the great next statement, and then the Torah says, because if you do, I will get angry at you and I will kill you, and your kids will also become orphans and your wives will become widows. And I think to myself, in the same part, it's like there are moments of moral grandeur and moral like sublimity. It's so sublime. And you think to yourself, wow, 2,500 years, like it's like at the same time as other cultures. I mean, oh my goodness. And then in the very next verse, it reminds you that it's a mixed bag, right? There's a mixed voice here that sometimes will hit us in the kishkes and say, so beautiful. And then the very next moment say, really? Really? And then we get back to our vav. Then we get back to the human beings engagement with the text and working with it. And, it's helping it become what it has to become. Like Amanda Gorman said, helping us realize what's innately a part of the Constitution. That's part of what we're doing in the world, is bringing it forward, right? Amen. But like what we should never say, and this is like also like, when rabbis I know get up from the pulpit and say, how could the Israeli this and that, or Israel or this, and they say, but in Torah, it's there's only, the Torah has multiple voices, the Jewish community has multiple voices, and we have to recognize that even if we champion one of those voices, let's be intellectually and morally honest that the Torah is a mixed bag. And like Jeffrey said, like, right, there are plenty of people who are sitting around, in Brooklyn today who don't believe that non-Jews should be sitting and learning Torah with us. There are people in Brooklyn today who don't think that they're women, and they even like their women or their children. Like, it's a very complicated, Judaism is a complicated thing, it's Judaism's, right? And so it behooves us to know as much as we can about it, and then engage ourselves in doing the work of Torah Shabbat Pen, arguing.
And to elect you as the head of as the Pope of Jewish.
I'm actually in the running for the Pope. It's true. I want the white smoke. I want the white smoke.
By the way, the wine job is a step in the right direction.
Thomas in the room has the last word.
Yeah,
Okay.
as someone who went from Catholicism, I'm trying to get away from it. I'm not gonna much as
Wrong choice of words.
Much as I love a good conclave. I can't resist briefly one more etymology.
Yes, we love your etymologies.
I know you're interested in clothing and being clothed in light, and I'm thinking of the threshold and the ear piercing and the tefillin and the mezuzah, and so I remember in these rituals of liberation from being a servant to being a member of the household. The action was to give the person clothing. And so you think of Adam and Eve, they're liberated from the Garden of Eden, they're given clothing, or they liberate themselves and they give themselves clothing of skin or of light or whatever. And so what is clothing? And so the etymology that I remembered, and it's just like too good to be true, is livery, which is this very old-fashioned word for clothing. You think of like
Livery.
Costume or uniform, like livery. Like it is the same word as liberty.
Wow.
Like you're given clothing
deliverance.
and active
Awesome.
deliverance.
And
You are-
deliverance.
And deliverance.
Wow.
And exactly. It's the same.
That's awesome.
So what does it mean to be clothed in freedom, to be sheltered, but also to be okay? Like now you're being put out the door as well, right? Like
It's really the Heart
clothing and
Sutra.
shelter.
Form is emptiness, emptiness is form.
Well, I was going to go not to the Heart Sutra, but that's also beautiful. But I was going to go to, again, I've been speaking about Martha Nussbaum, and those who know her work at University of Chicago, professor of law.
She was my professor.
She was your professor. So Professor
Oh my
Nussbaum, who was a professor of law and philosophy at the University of Chicago, a lot of her work is focused on capabilities and about human capabilities and kind of moral and ethical demands that capabilities, right, are the precondition for. Because we have capabilities, therefore we have responsibilities. And when asked about what the through line in all of her work is, whether it's how we treat one another or treat other human beings, her response is that all of my work is about human vulnerability. All ethics and morality is about the vulnerabilities that each and every human being has.
Awesome.
And the boundaries between us expose us to others' capabilities and our vulnerabilities. And clothing is itself both literally and symbolically that which shelters us from our own vulnerabilities, from our own limitations. We can't clothe ourselves, as it were, right? Animals have fur, but we are exposed to the elements, and the clothing becomes the beginning of our own responsibility. Like in the Talmud, it says that when we were in the Torah says that when we're in the desert. When Moshe looks back, he says, "Simlatcha lo valta me'alecha," right? Your garments, all these 40 years were taken care of, like they didn't wither. Meaning, like that level of exposure to the elements was provided for, right? And so there's a certain place where freedom, deliverance, and livery, as you said, which is so deep, like it's so amazing that clothing becomes the symbol of that which is the liminal space between us and the rest of the world, where our skin is like the boundary, right? It's really amazing. Anyway, wow. So much here. We barely touched the surface, but I'm so sorry those who didn't get a chance to speak. We have to go and open upstairs for davening. Sending everybody a huge good Shabbos and many blessings to you all, and we'll see you, God willing, next week. We'll see you.